Hello, welcome. I'm Megan Smith from New Business Development, and I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Judith Demuth, who is here from MIT today. Judith's work is fabulous. Every time I get to go to the Media Lab and see something new that she's done, I have yet another vantage point into how social media or communications media work. Today, she's going to talk, as you see, about signals, truth, and design, and everybody got the email, so I'm not going to go into detail there. She runs the Sociable Media Research Group, and they work a lot on the social side of computing, graphic design, urban studies, cognitive science, all these things pulled together into a lot of interface work that they do for online communities and virtual identities. She's known for tremendous social visualization and interface design. I see some UI folks here, so I'm very happy you guys are here to see some of the amazing work that she's done. And you guys have a copy of her bio, so I won't read from it. But I'm just so happy she was in town, and I asked her to come and talk to us. And I think there's a lot we can gain at Google always by looking at sort of how things are really working and taking another point of view. And she's done a tremendous job throughout her research in doing that.
Thank you, Megan. So just as a start, not to contradict that, I do a tremendous amount, as Megan said, of visualization work, interface design. This talk is going to be kind of light on the design work, though I guess you can all vote and you can say, stop this, we'll just talk about design instead. What I wanted to talk about today was some more underlying theory about thinking about social interaction online and how people communicate, and some of the ways of thinking that inform the sort of work that we do. I'll put in a little bit of some of our interface design work maybe at the end, but this is more of a talk about new ways of thinking about how people communicate and why particular designs are interesting. And what I'd like to start with is introducing this notion of signaling. Signaling is a theory that comes from the world of biology. The first person to really look at this was an Israeli biologist named Amos Zahavi. And he was interested in some of the natural phenomena, such as you look at, there's moose that have these tremendous horns and like these big antlers. And these antlers are very metabolically costly. Or you look at some bizarre behaviors in nature. It turns out that some kinds of gazelles, when they see an enemy, instead of running away as fast as they can, which would seem like the sensible thing to do if you're one of the fastest creatures on Earth, instead what they do is they jump up and down in place, which seems kind of a peculiar thing to do. And he was interested in coming up with an understanding of why would these phenomena happen. And he came up with this idea of handicap signaling, which says that sometimes if what you are doing is trying to advertise some kind of resource that you have in great quantity, the best way to advertise it is to waste it. So if the gazelle has a great deal of speed, one of the things that jumping up and down is doing is wasting speed. It's a way of saying, I am so fast, I can just sit here and jump up and down, use up my energy, use up this time, and you can go and chase someone else. And it turns out that predators do not chase the gazelles that do this, because they know that the all-out rate, that once they start to take off after them, it will be a fast, all-out, energy-losing race that they're likely to lose. And so many of these things have turned out to be honest signals, that by wasting particular resources is a way of honestly displaying them. Now, when we look at a lot of ways of self-presentation on the net today, honesty is not really the first thing that comes to mind. It's always been a big issue, for instance, in dating sites, where it's just as easy for me to say, I am who I am. I could say I'm the Queen of England. I could say that I'm a 35-year-old male bodybuilder. There's really none of those types of cost that keep things honest. Now, there's various other things as we start to, most of what we see about people's self-presentation is not necessarily a flat-out lie. For instance, in dating sites, many people figure that at some point they're going to actually meet someone, and some of the truth of what they're saying needs to come out. But then there's others who are doing this as a game. There's the whole sort of bored fraternity brother theory of dating site, how many people can I get to answer this ad? So they may be completely imaginary. So what we're interested in doing in my group now is looking at signaling theory to get some kind of understanding of how we can design sites, not so that everything has to be honest, but so that as designers, we start being able to understand the way that if you're a restaurant designer, you can play with different types of lighting. You can say, I want to make a nice family-friendly place where everything is clean and people are fast, and I'm going to use those bright halogen lights. Or you could say, I want this slow, romantic dinner, so everything's going to be dark. And yes, if this was a fast food restaurant, it would be so dark you would not be able to see the cockroaches go by. But considering it's a very expensive, fancy restaurant, we're not worried about lighting to see the dirt under the table. So in such a way, what we're interested in is helping people understand how they can go about using sort of the whole range of design strategies for making social interaction more honest and reliable. So I'm going to give you a quick background on signaling theory and then show how it applies to some kinds of online design. The first thing is a vocabulary piece. We can think about any of the things that people use to get information about others are cues. Some cues are intentional. These are the ones we're interested in terms of signaling. And there's what I'm going to call evidence or unintentional cues, which is also a great deal of what we read from each other. But the notion is that the signals are things that are intended for communication. And it's this intentionality in the communication that gives rise to the types of dynamics. I use a fur coat as an example because a lot of things can be a mix of intentional and unintentional signals. So for instance, someone can wear a fur coat to say, oh, look at me, I am so stylish. And not only am I stylish, I am rich. I am wearing a coat that while I could stay warm for $150 from Land's End of season sale, I've instead chosen to spend $15,000 on it. So it's a fairly reliable signal of wealth. It's a signal of stylishness depending on the cut. However, someone looking at them may read these signals, but they also may say that the cue that they see is, oh, this person is cruel to animals, heartless and thoughtless. So that is not an intentional signal. That was still something that is being picked up on by the person looking at them. So here's these examples of the assessment signals I was telling you about at the beginning. These are costly signals. For those who are interested, I can give you URLs at the end of more extensive papers about this. But these are signals where, because there's some way of wasting a resource, this resource can be time. One of the earliest sort of proto-signaling theory writers was a early sociologist named Thorstein Veblen, who you may have heard of. He's famous for coining the phrase conspicuous consumption. And he was a social critic at the turn of the 19th century. And one of the things, he wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class. He was interested in, if leisure is such a sign of status, it's how do you know that someone has a lot of leisure time? I don't really want to spend a whole year watching you do nothing to know that, yep, you really didn't have to work for that year. But so what he talked about was effectively assessment signals for wasting time. And his examples were knowing dead languages, raising pedigreed dogs, things like that, where there are all kinds of things that take enormous amounts of time but don't provide any income. And and effectively, these are assessment signals of time. So it's many kinds of resources you can look at in this way. Obviously, people buy luxury goods as an assessment signal of wealth. And again, one of the things to keep in mind is we'll be talking in a minute about conventional signals, which are things where there is no cost associated with them. So most things are signals of many, many things. Again, something like a very expensive car may be a signal of wealth and the ability to waste money in order to show a high level of income. But someone buying it might say, well, I'm really buying this so that I look so that it can seem very, very sexy and attractive. But that quality is not required by being the owner of the car. So we have learned by convention to associate it with that, but it's not necessarily a reliable indicator of attractiveness, even though it may be meant to be one by association. Something can be a signal of, something can be costly in terms of missed opportunities. So what you can say is something like being, having multiple facial piercings is a way of saying, in a reliable sense, that you are affiliated with a alternative lifestyle, because what you have done is put yourself in a position to pay the cost of being unemployable in a whole range, or being unpresentable in a whole range of other situations. So costs can be in time, they can be in resources, they can be in opportunities. Indices, and I will talk in a minute, so you'll keep this tiger in mind. Indices are another type of signal that's very reliable because it's impossible to fake. It requires some kind of natural ability or native ability that you simply have to have that ability in order to show the signal. The tiger is used, there's a book called Animal Signals by a British biologist named John Maynard Smith, and he used the tiger as his example of index signals, because it turns out that it's a way of signaling size. It turns out, like, if you're a really big tiger and you scratch really high up on the tree. If you're a little tiny tiger, your scratches are just not that high. So the height of the scratches on a tree is a reliable territory marker of height among tigers. And the reason it's interesting, well, we'll get into that in a minute, just to keep the tiger in mind. Obviously, some things like, having big muscles is a index of strength. It's not necessarily something that wastes strength, but it is, especially if you are showing it off in a particular way. So there's signals that are amplifiers of particular indices. If you're very strong and you walk around in a bikini, that's an amplification of an index of strength. Conventional signals are signals where one of the things with these assessment signals, they're costly for the person or animal giving the signal. They may be costly to assess. Conventional signals are things that don't have these associated costs. They are less reliable, but they're also less costly. But they're very, very common. Less common in the animal kingdom, though they're not completely absent, but they're very, very common. A huge amount of human communication, and particularly our communication online, is in the form of conventional signals. And conventional signals are far less reliable, but what we have, especially among humans, is there's other ways of keeping them reliable. In particular, society can add costs, such as punishment costs. So for instance, I might decide, there's a lot of traffic here. It would be very, very convenient for me to put a siren on top of my car so that I could pretend to be a policeman. A siren is effectively a conventional signal of being a policeman. I checked. It's really easy to buy them online. You could just order them. And I could sit there and say, I'm a policeman, excuse me, out of my way. But there's such a high punishment cost to doing that. It turns out that the punishment of impersonating a policeman is really, really not worth it to get home 15 minutes faster. And so society manages to rebalance these types of costs. The understanding that type of dynamics is particularly important because in the animal world, there's very little ability to fake the more assessment or index type signals, but humans can fake almost anything. And one of the reasons I like that tiger example is because Maynard Smith, in his explanation of tigers, it's not a very humorous book in general, but at the end of his description, he said, now this would not be a reliable signal if tigers could figure out how to stand on boxes, but they haven't. But humans actually are very good at doing things like figuring out how to stand on boxes. So we always find some way of faking some kind of signal. There's very, very little that you can think of that's a reliable signal, that there's not some way, if the benefits of faking it are high enough, that it's not fake. So deception occurs when it's beneficial to the signaler. So the cost of doing the fake signal is beneficial to them, but deception is very, very costly to the receivers, usually. I mean, some kinds of deception aren't. We live in a world in which there's almost constant levels of deception. I have 2 little kids. For any of you who have children, one of the things you start to realize, a lot of what you do in civilizing children is teaching them to lie. You do not tell people you think they're ugly. You do not tell your grandmother what you think of the present she gave you. Yeah, there's just an awful lot of things you don't want to tell the truth about. Children are not very deceptive. We spend a great deal of time teaching them how to lie, when to lie, what are the right kinds of lies, how to ignore other people's obvious lies, and things like that. So, but in the cases where it's very, for the receiver, when they have deemed it to be in some way costly, there needs to be some way of changing that. And also deception is very costly to honest signalers, because what it does is it makes the reliability of their signal as a whole decrease. So when the cost to the receivers is too high, they'll cease listening to the signal. If you know, for instance, when people first got online, most people assumed that when someone said, I'm a 26-year-old buxom woman who is just looking to spend an evening of love with you, that this was amazing, but it was great, and they were really psyched. It didn't take that long for the receivers of messages such as that to start to realize that actually it probably wasn't true. And that the result there was simply to ignore many, many messages like that. Another possible, as we said, another possible thing is if society as a whole decides that this is costly, to increase the cost by adding societal punishments. If the cost of the honest signalers is too high, and you'll see how, once we get into some specific example of these dynamics, one thing they may have to do is just find a more reliable signal. One of the things they're going to be talking about, some of the examples will go into greater depth here, is the notion of fashion, and how fashion in many domains is effectively a way of constantly changing the forms of signals as imitators come up to constantly try and maintain a new but honest signal. The other possibility is that everybody starts to become deceptive. I think one of the things that's really interesting in our society is, as an example, is all the things that in previous generations, such as having crow's feet, the age marks as honest as cues of age, have now turned into signals that as the technology has changed and things like plastic surgery and all kinds of youth-enhancing formulas become much more ubiquitous, many things that had previously only been cues start to become these signals of how much time, energy, and pain are you willing to dedicate to looking youthful. So anyway, so one of the things that we can do with signaling is start to explain seemingly irrational behaviors. I think an example that's very interesting, going back to sort of the beauty version, is sun tanning. I mean, sun tanning is a extremely common, almost ubiquitous human behavior. Yet historically, it's had a very, very different meaning. When you, do you have a question? Or it looked like there was some confusion. It's a beach scene. But one of the things that's very interesting about sun tanning is that tanning is a signal of social position very much related to leisure. And it's one of these sort of basic stories of how cultural mores change, is that at a time when if you were wealthy, you were able to stay out of the sun, when many of the people who were poor and labored in the fields were out getting tan and brown. Having a tan was not considered any kind of status signal. As increasing amounts of low-status labor started to move into factories, slowly the cultural perception of the meaning of tan skin changed, and most of the social histories of this say that it was Coco Chanel who made it very explicit, sometime I think in the 1940s, that tanning was now the high status symbol, because many people that in order to have a tan, and particularly tan in the winter, meant that you had to have the leisure to go to a sunny location, and so the whole social meaning of it changed. But it's also a very interesting phenomenon as time went on, this is a poster from the 60s, it became something that was very, very popular. People spend a lot of time lying in the sun, trying to get a tan, saying, okay, I have like 4 more hours on this side, I have to turn on this side and spend a few more hours this way. And then you'd have this mark that said, I've had the leisure to do this, I have the time, if it's winter especially, I've had the opportunity to go someplace sunny. And then around, between 1980s, 1990s, some very interesting things came up. So first of all, what we see is that, we're human, and so we figured out that way of standing on a box. It turns out there's boxes to stand on in order to get a tan. And cosmetics industry spent untold amounts of money both figuring out how to make fake tans that you could slather on, the development of a huge industry in sun tanning equipment so that you could spend your entire week slaving away in the office and then go home, spend an hour a day at the tanning booth down the street, and come out at least looking, though it had not actually been any kind of reality, like you too had this wonderful leisurely life. But what's also very interesting about it as I said was an irrational behavior that's interesting is that when people talk about tanning, when people have been interviewed, what you like about it is that it makes you look healthy. It makes you look like you've been outdoors. And at the same time that it's become increasingly associated with notions of health, many medical reports have come out saying this is an extremely unhealthy thing to do. This is going to kill you. If you go tan, you're going to get sun cancer. Also, it's associated a lot with people feeling like they look young, that they feel healthy. It's going to make your skin wrinkled. So one of the questions that you can look at through signaling this way, and it's one of these things, there's a lot of academic papers looking at how can we get people to stop tanning. There's all kinds of warning ads. And I think if you look at it as a signal, you can look at it from a very different perspective that's very interesting. Because if you say, well, actually, maybe as a signal, there's something about wanting to signal now, being young and youthful and healthy, that the idea that this is so unhealthy is actually beneficial for the signal, not for the person necessarily. Because it now becomes, in addition to everything else, it becomes a way of saying, I am so confident of my youthfulness and my imperviousness to melanoma and all kinds of diseases that happen to other people, that I can go out and defy all of these odds and lie in the sand, in the sun, or in the tanning bed, and come out and look great. And it's in some ways because there are increased numbers of warning that it then strengthens this behavior as a way of showing that you have this enormous excess of the resource of health. And so as a way of looking at things, it's a very, very interesting way of trying to analyze this because, for instance, if you look at all kinds of prevention programs, whether it's trying to get people from sun tanning to I've been working somewhat with someone who's been trying to do a lot of safer sex work among teenagers, that realizing that there are often the desire to do something dangerous because of its riskiness, not in spite of it, and looking at how that functions as what the communicative function of doing that is really, really important in trying to understand how to devise better campaigns for influencing behavior. The example I'd like to go into in a little more depth here, because I think it's of a particular interest in the context of Google, is this notion of fashion. And by fashion, I don't mean just clothing, but there's fashion in all kinds of things. Not only our particular blogging sites, but blogs themselves really function as fashion. So let's just back up for a second and say, well, what do I mean by fashion? One way, in terms of signaling, the way of thinking about fashion is that it's something where the form of the signal itself changes over time, though the thing that's being indicated remains the same. And in particular, fashions are signals of social status and affiliation. We'll talk about this in a minute, and of information access in a very, very information-based society. So you can look at a lot of blogs and say, there's a huge fashion component to blogging, where any one piece of news that's there isn't the key. It's this notion of saying on a daily basis now, we have to link to the right thing. If I want my blog to be at a certain level of up-to-dateness where other people will link to it because it has interesting things, I have to be able to go out and navigate through this complex world of information and find the thing that is the right thing to be linking to today. And you can, there's been a number, obviously I'm sure you've done a bunch of these here, of these measurements of sort of how waves of links move through the blogging world, where you have a small number of early adopters, and then you have the early set of the people who find the first ones, and there's the ones who go out and link to something at the very beginning. Then there's like this big mainstream wave. It's like lots and lots of other people whose blogs are not read to find the forefront, but just who, in order to say, yes, my blog is actually a display of my being up to date in the world of information, within like 3 to 5 days have the same link, and then it kind of tails off, and then a couple of weeks go by and nobody's linking to it again. If we look at it in terms of risk, there's the risk is much higher, as with any kind of fashion, for the people at the very forefront, because whether it's clothing, fashion, it's saying, well, did you just invest in something that is going to be laughable, that is never going to catch on, but you were at the forefront, but you made a mistake about this. But in the blogging world, the people who are really anxious to be at that forefront, the ones who are putting in 4, 5, 6 hours a day writing a blog, have to pick through all the information they come across and know that they have to pick something that is going to become popular. If you pick something that no one is going to find interesting, you will start to lose readership, but it can't have already become popular. So there's the high cost of finding that information and the risk in either writing about something that's going to turn out not to be true. There was, like an example, there was a brief flurry a couple of months ago when I was writing about this, of news stories about how the McDonald's interactive games division, does anyone know this story? So it was one of these things that kind of tailed off quickly. Apparently McDonald's had this interactive games division that was supposed to be doing simulations within McDonald's of like their future development, where they should be opening up new branches, et cetera. And at this game developers conference on serious games and simulation, they came in and they said, we've seceded from McDonald's because they're not listening to our recommendations, because it turns out everything we found when we started adding in all these models that included environmental impact, that McDonald's and the amount of meat that we are using and the cows that we are supporting is such a huge impact on global warming that we are going to go out of business just because everyone's going to die. And the way they actually did it was a little bit less fake sounding than this. And there were a whole bunch of blogs that picked up on this story, that this is really how people need to behave, that this is how people have to be responsible if you try and, that they'd quit and they'd put their jobs on the line and their reputations. There was a great deal of excitement about this, very, very briefly, until eventually turned out to have been a hoax. So it's an example of the risk that you can make by being at the forefront of a story, in that it was also very, very embarrassing for a number of fairly high-profile writers who had, taken this, hook, line, and sinker. So that's just one example. But there's, but there's also fashions in, and there's obviously fashions in music, Interestingly enough, it's also one of these things that's moving increasingly into that space between public presentations of self. What your taste in music is really puts you in a particular affiliation, and it also is something where it requires being able to keep up with what is the right thing to listen to. So it certainly functions as a fashion. But there's also fashions in management is prone to fashion in a tremendous way. If you were, 20 years ago, if you were a fashionable consultant, you could talk about quality circles. Today you talk about social networking. But there's an enormous amount of fashion in this information-based world. I mean, some of it may have to do with the actual value of the thing. Maybe particular ways of doing management are better than others, but a tremendous amount of it can also be notions of fashion, of saying, I am up to date within this world. This is fashion in modern art. This is painter John Curran, who started painting in this style. He's now one of the, he's the top contemporary artist with some of the highest sales. He's had one-man shows at all the big museums in New York. When he was started painting in the 1980s, there was very, very little figurative painting at all, and but he changed, and his peers changed the style of painting. But it's certainly the whole contemporary arts world is very, very fashion-based. So these are just some examples of the different dimensions, not just clothing, that fashion exists in. But what's interesting here to think about in terms of signaling and how you can think of this in terms of design is that if you think of it as a form of information prowess, some of the things that need to be balanced again here is this notion of the cost of the signal versus the benefits that come from it. So here, just showing some ubiquitous examples of the types of fashion. So let's look at something like an iPhone, or little Bluetooth earpieces for phones. They certainly are functioning as fashion. Almost any kind of technological innovation has a big fashion side to it. It's saying, I'm going to, it may be programming languages. There's Ruby on Rails can be thought of as a fashion. There's particular, and when you adopt, whether it's a new technology, a new programming language, when you come in at the very early end, you take that risk that you're going to do something that's going to kind of fall off the world. You may start to learn a new programming language that it turns out after you spend 6 months studying it, learning it, becoming an expert in it, kind of folds. Nobody ever uses it. It becomes unsupported. All your effort was in vain. On the other hand, if you learn a new programming language and you're the first one to do it and has these new capabilities, and then you get to tell all your other colleagues about this great language you knew, and then they start to realize that everyone's using it, but you were the one that they heard about this from first, it gives you that status of being shown to be much more knowledgeable, to be at the forefront. So when you look at something like this in terms of the economics of signaling, there's the fashion signaling that says, where am I in this adoption curve? And then you start to weigh it between the benefits and the costs, because if you look at things as innovation, there's a certain level of benefit that you get anyway. And then as we see from signals, that benefit fights against it as a signal, because the benefit could be, if something is obviously just better, it doesn't function as well in some ways as a fashion signal, because it can be adopted by many people without being particularly risky or showing their commitment to that particular hierarchy. Whereas if it has either some great difficulty associated with it, if it has, and that difficulty, whether it's a difficulty of learning or it's a style of painting that to the contemporary eye looks really ugly, it has that risk to it that says, I'm willing to pay the cost of this risk in order to adopt it. And then what's interesting, I think what's also particularly useful about thinking about it today is understanding the dynamics within fashion, both as the signal and how the benefits and costs that are associated with innovation adoption play off it in terms of a signal. Because a very interesting thing that we're seeing now is it's important in two things. One is that it's accelerating at a fantastic rate. Most accounts of fashion as a cultural phenomenon put it at around the 15th century. 15th and 16th century is really the beginning of fashion, certainly in clothing, but in many other things. So remember, when we talk back of like when someone is copying a signal, if you look at costume, for instance, in medieval Europe, for one, people's clothing did not change from generation to generation. The things your parents were wearing around the time you were born were probably the things you would wear throughout your life. There were differences in costume based on class, but for various reasons between simply very, very limited notions of social mobility, plus sumptuary laws that forbade copying things. People did not say, oh, I'm going to achieve social mobility by imitating the appearance and actions of those in a social position I would like to have. It was completely unheard of. As our society became more mobile, I'm not going to give a big general history of Western civilization course, but one way of understanding the role of fashion is that as society became more mobile and the possibility of trying to change social class through a number of reasons, some of which changes of wealth, but also through imitations of particular kinds of behavior, was really the birth of fashion. But in the 16th century, there's reports of princesses in Poland writing to their advisors that they really wanted to see dolls from Paris. A lot of the fashion news would be distributed through these little dolls, but it would take a year for the doll to get from Paris to a country manor in the outskirts of Poland. And so the rate of change of fashion was very slow. Society was more static, but also simply information moved very slowly. We're now living in an era where information moves across the globe instantly. And one of the things that's very interesting is whether you're looking at it in terms of clothing, of music, of what kinds of information, whether it's from blogs or news feeds, that you need to be able to keep up with on a daily basis in order to maintain a level of sort of general knowledge that's considered, that's expected, has rapidly accelerated. And so understanding how people are using these different ways of both accessing information, but how information itself is becoming a way of self-presentation and of identity, I think, is very, very important. And I think that's one of the pieces that's particularly relevant to the type of work that a lot of you, I think, are doing here, is understanding different ways of understanding what it is that people want to do with all this information they're getting. We're developing huge numbers of technology that say, here's a news feed, here's a visualization, here's a whole new way of getting at this stuff. But this is about looking at why are people trying to, why do you look at things like MySpace pages that have news feeds and blog feeds and everything, and how are people using information as a way of positioning themselves in increasingly both mobile and information-based world? I'm going to talk about one example of a piece that we developed in response to this, and then I'm going to open this for questions. This is a piece called, I'm going to talk about two things, about a piece called Urban Hermes. And what we were interested in here was finding ways to take the fast fashion of the online world into the physical spaces. And so what this is it's a messenger bag, because we were seeing, we could foresee this as being something that was clothing or anything else, but right now, considering the amount of technology we had to put in back of it, sticking it into a messenger bag was fairly useful. But it's a display that would have a picture on it that you could change, but it works on Bluetooth. And so it could also sense when people were in your vicinity that you were using the same system, and anyone could see what they were displaying, but depending on the types of communication channels you chose to open up with others, people who you had certain things in common with could copy what you had on your bag, and vice versa. And so what's interesting here was I'm not going to get into the details here because we're running a little short on time, but what you could do here was you could both be able to copy things instantly, but not have it be done without your actual actions and decision to do that, much as you don't suddenly shoes don't teleport onto you. But also you'd be able to see the provenance of things. So an image that you picked up from somebody else because you happened to be in the same club with them, you could also track it as it had moved throughout society, but it was all based on face-to-face encounters in tracking how these things moved. So it's really about taking the speed of the internet fashion and bringing it into physical spaces. and I can send you anyone who's interested, I can show papers on that. Then I want to just leave with one sort of completely different thought on the notion of signaling, is the question, are you human? And this is, I think, finally one of the most interesting questions that people are going to be dealing with on a daily basis. And again, it's very interesting as a signaling question. I have a student who's been doing a lot of research lately in my space, developing machine learning algorithms for trying to understand what are the different human-like components of particular pages, which are pages that are created by people to talk with other people, which are much more corporate ones that are put together by whether it's bands or increasingly companies advertising something, and which messages are being sent out by agents pretending to be humans when they're not. Is there some kind of pattern for ones that claim to be human, but in actuality are not human? And this becomes a question that I think has tremendous implications in the next few years, that not only is this something that people are going to be trying to understand, whether it's in social networking sites where there's increasing numbers of pages that are in actuality corporate entities or jokes or something else, but are saying that they are human, to chat spaces, all kinds of discussions where there may be participants that are not in fact human, but also on things where we have to ask underneath some of the interesting questions about actually when is it that we care. There's in Japan especially increasing numbers of robotics projects saying here we can build a robotic animal that will be a companion for the elderly and the lonely. And so what? That it doesn't really have any feelings. It can act so well that it has feelings, it can make you feel better. And so the signaling questions that we've been talking about here, when put into trying to question what does it mean to be able to signal you're human, start to address some of these issues. Anyway, thank you, and I'd like to welcome any questions.
So your urban promise project, essentially it seems like you're trying to change your signal because you can't manifest your signals by wearing specific clothing, but when you project something on your screen, some of your interests, and you have people coming by looking at your screen saying with similar interests, you project a different personality essentially. You can be a shy person with your clothing, but then you can display your interests on a little screen on your bag and make other people to contact you based on that. So you project you change the signal in this way, right?
It really is much more in the sort of tradition of the fashion, because part of it is you can see if someone had started, like where in a whole trajectory were they. So once you say, I'm interested in something, you adopt it from someone, what you're able to see is, were they the first or the second? Are you at the very beginning of this? Or are you the 500th person to take it? So it tends to be more function within this realm of, and then you also get to see how far off it spreads. So it's much more a signal of position within a hierarchy of adoption than about, so part of it is, when we look at anything that's any kind of fashion resource is always encoded in something else, whether it's clothing or management style, et cetera. So the content of it has that information that says, if it's a picture of Hello Kitty, do you judge that this is something you want to be adopting because of your general aesthetics and knowledge and other things? So it's using that content to give you a cue about where you will end up there.
Yeah, so the fashion statement is just kind of scratching the surface, but then it causes people to communicate more in the real life because they're already used to assume different personalities in the online world, right? But they kind of tend to be very shy around other people. But now you can project kind of your interest on your little screen and have more communication with people with similar interests.
Yeah, I didn't get into that particular issue here, but a tremendous number of the projects that we do that are, in our work as a whole, are about trying to find ways to break down a lot of the barriers between people's communication in face-to-face spaces. That there's obviously that is very, very open when you're at a distance from others, but how can we use these kind of hybrid spaces to break down the barriers? Yes?
Have you examined the adoption rates of new products or fashions when the signals are not necessarily all aligned? So maybe there's a signal that has a high cost in one area, so maybe it takes time to learn it, or to go out and learn a new product that you bought, but the actual cost in monetary terms is low. So instead of Apple introducing an iPhone at $500, signaling not only that it's costly to learn this new system, but also costly in monetary terms, but they introduced it at $200. How does that affect adoption rates?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research in that area. There's a book called The Diffusion of Innovations by Everett Rogers, who did a lot of work on innovation research. And what I've done with the signaling theory is there's a long history of theories about fashion that are based on George Simmel's work on imitation and differentiation. It basically says those who are of somewhere lower on some hierarchy are trying to imitate those who are above them, and those above them differentiate. The innovation research looks at what turned out to be similar phenomenon, but comes up with a very different model, which is that people want to be in different places in some kind of adoption. And he has this notion of the early adopters and later ones, and people want to be in these particular spaces. And one of the contributions of looking at it as a signal is it's a way that you can take both of these models and unite them to show that the costs and benefits of the innovation can function as the costs that ensure the reliability of the signal in terms of social signaling, because the innovation work tends to really ignore how much people do things for social status. He has one little footnote saying, oops, I should talk about this because we really don't, but in our interviews, people always deny that they're doing things for status. Very, very few people, no matter how trendy the thing they have just gone out and done or said or bought, says, yes, I was doing that to look like I'm even more high status than I am. They will always come up with some reason why it was practical or useful or a tremendous sale. But they will almost never admit it. So if your research is all on looking at why people did that, but the price point things is fairly common in marketing and research. And here it's more about trying to find a unified way of bringing in the social signaling aspect that I believe is a tremendous driving force that is much often ignored in most of the marketing world. So, yes?
I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the disruptiveness of computers in this environment, because a lot of your examples sort of come from evolutionary biology, where you have the peacock's tail or the butterfly that mimics something that tastes bad. And that's a very slow-moving process, kind of like fashion in the 15th century. But now, instead of going out on the quad and saying, hey, can I borrow a quarter from everybody I meet, I can harvest 1 million emails and send them out. And the orders of magnitude of change is really dramatic. And I must think that has an effect.
Yeah, well, I think it has a tremendous effect, and it's in some ways sort of the point of what I'm saying, is that we are living in an era where the rate of change of meaning is so rapid that it becomes a tremendous cost in and itself, that time and attention and the ability to process information has become an enormous resource that people need to be displaying that's that notion of information prowess. So if you forget about evolutionary time, which is extremely slow, but if you lived 700 or 800 years ago, there certainly was a lot of information you might need to deal with in your daily life, but it changed very, very slowly. So that ability to harvest new information wasn't something that was a tremendous cutoff in terms of resources, but for contemporary people, the ability to both show your ability to find the right information in a vast overload of information, how you display that prowess of doing it. You know, I didn't get into some of the more complexities of the models that I've been developing here, because one of the things that's very interesting about thinking about how people display their ability, their prowess with information, is that unlike other resources where you can waste them and then they're gone, information spreads. It's not something that's transferred from one to another. You cannot throw it away. The fact that I have told you something doesn't mean that I don't know it anymore, as opposed to if I give it to somebody. And so, so I think a lot of this is in the work of trying to understand what are the dynamics of information as a resource as it moves faster and faster. Any other questions? Yes?
So, I was wondering about your slide where you talked about the acceleration in fashion. And I was just wondering what you actually meant by acceleration. Because, so I can understand that, you know, in the 15th century, when fashions need to travel from, let's say, Paris to England, you know, sure, it's going to take like a month or something like that for that to happen. But I guess, I mean, that's just one way of looking at it, right? It's one metric of saying, well, this is how long it literally takes the information to propagate. But whether or not that meme will actually catch on, if the English court at that time happens to be particularly hostile towards the French throne, then, well, it doesn't matter how long those memes take to catch on. I mean, it doesn't matter how long those memes take to propagate, they're not going to catch on. So similarly now, with the spread of information, you have information is diffusing much faster. But, you know, also you're going to have much smaller groups. I mean, the number of, whereas, you know, assuming in the 15th century or the 16th century, you have a lot more people in England who are willing to dress the way the court is. Right now, that number is going to be much smaller. Right? I mean, you have much smaller groups, and there's going to be resistance to information influencing different groups as it travels. So,
let me just, because there's a couple of really interesting points you've raised. So let me just try and answer you while I can still keep track of them. So the last thing you talked about is really about the fragmentation of society, and you know, when we talk about status and affiliation, I mean, a lot of that's the affiliative aspect of it, is to say that the traditional notions of fashion, for instance, when Simmel first talked about imitation differentiation, his model was of a single, very stratified society. I think you can look here in any number of multiple subcategories, and people exist within a whole variety of these. So there are fashions and music, but, you know, people can participate in different subcultures there. There are many different possible groups. You know, you can think of nations as different ones. There's subcultures within academics, not only within particular departments, but people will move according to a different hierarchy. We could say there's a nearly infinite number of hierarchies. This phenomenon happens both within them and between them. Your first question about what did I mean by the rate of acceleration, I simply meant that the amount of time that a particular form lasts as a signal of something being at a particular point in some hierarchy has gotten much faster, the rate of change. And you can, you know, if you're looking for specific examples, there's a lot of work in, for instance, in clothing fashion, just in how much less time, you know, even in the last 20 years, particular things have stayed in fashion. There's quotes from Diana Vreeland and Winterthur talking about, you know, how the season in which they measure what is a particular style has become much faster. There's an interesting, I don't have it with me, but there's an interesting graphic of how long songs stay as hit music from the 1950s to the present. And so, you know, I think it starts out as something generally staying as a top hit for 4 weeks. You know, now it's often down to a period of days. So it's simply that rate is changing, and I think a lot of the cause is that information just moves much more quickly. And so, you know, it's no longer a matter of having to wait, you know, if you want to listen to some, you know, to music, of having to wait until your local record store, you know, somewhere in South Dakota gets around to getting some music shipped out to them before you can have that record. If everyone can download it instantly, it's going to affect that rate of change. So, I don't know if I missed some other main point. Yes?
So when you say that fragmentation is kind of an adaptation
to the information, because that way I can say, well, I'm in this group, and if this information, doesn't apply to me, I don't have to take in all this giant flow. If you're not wearing black, and I'm a goth, then I don't have to worry about you, or if it's not hip hop, I don't have to listen to it, and so I can ignore that information.
Yeah, I think that's probably is one of the reasons for that type of fragmentation. There's many other theories about why we live in a more fragmented society, and I think some of it's very hard to look at these things without the historical perspective, because things that look vastly different to us when we're living in the midst of them may all just look like one big blur of early 21st century things 200 years from now. So I think some of it is also that the closer you are to a particular era, the more nuances you see within the culture. I think it's also very easy to look at history and see it as a single unified culture, but I think some of it is also has to do with how stratified a particular society is and how much of a single common culture there is. So I have one more question, I think it's time. Okay.
So we're going to be down in Charlotte for lunch if anybody wants to join us. You're welcome. And I want to thank Mr. Bennett for joining us.